At 9:17 p.m., in a ballroom glowing beneath crystal chandeliers and filled with senators, hedge fund managers, and executives whose signatures move markets, a single glass of Bordeaux tipped forward and changed the trajectory of 3 companies. The room fell silent as red wine spread across a white tuxedo shirt worn by a man few guests recognized, but many would soon remember. She believed she was correcting an intrusion, asserting social order in a space she considered carefully curated. What she did not understand was that the quiet man standing in front of her was not a gatecrasher, not staff, not an outsider, but the final decision-maker on a billion-dollar infrastructure allocation her husband's firm had spent 3 exhausting years trying to secure. By sunrise, legal teams were on emergency calls. By noon, directors were reviewing exposure risks. Within 48 hours, a contract that promised to stabilize a publicly traded company had been reassigned. This was never about spilled wine. It was about power, perception, and a misjudgment made in full public view. Stay with us, because what unfolded behind closed doors the following morning reshaped reputations, erased fortunes, and exposed how fragile status can be when measured against authority that does not announce itself. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a social slight escalated into a financial earthquake, we need to rewind several years before that evening. The executive at the center of the incident, whom we will call Daniel Reed, built his firm during a period when American infrastructure funding was shifting toward private-public partnerships, a model widely reported on by outlets such as the Wall Street Journal and Forbes as cities searched for capital beyond traditional tax revenue. Reed's company specialized in acquiring distressed urban assets and restructuring them with pension fund backing, a strategy that echoed real trends following the 2008 financial crisis, when institutional investors began seeking long-term, stable returns in infrastructure projects. Unlike legacy executives who inherited networks, Reed's rise mirrored the stories often profiled in Harvard Business Review case studies. First-generation graduate, former analyst, relentless operator. He was known among municipal leaders as disciplined and cautious, a negotiator who preferred data over spectacle. Industry analysts had recently speculated that the Federal Transportation Expansion Initiative, similar in scale to infrastructure packages debated across multiple administrations, would channel billions through allocation committees chaired by figures like Reed. His role was influential, though rarely advertised in society columns. Across town, the firm pursuing that allocation, which we will refer to as Whitmore Holdings, carried a different history. Established in the late 1970s by the father of its current CEO, it grew during an era when construction conglomerates thrived on defense contracts and highway expansion. By the early 2020s, however, Whitmore faced mounting pressure. Public filings, similar to those seen on the SEC's Edgar database for comparable firms, showed declining quarterly earnings and rising debt obligations. Analysts on financial networks frequently discuss how mid-sized infrastructure companies can become vulnerable when a single major contract represents an outsized percentage of projected revenue. For Whitmore, the Federal Urban Redevelopment Project represented stabilization. Its board had approved aggressive bidding strategies, and executives privately assured investors that approval was highly likely. What few considered was the reputational review clause embedded within modern procurement processes, a safeguard increasingly emphasized in government transparency reforms after high-profile corporate scandals over the past 2 decades. Reputation, in this new environment, was not cosmetic, it was contractual. On the night of the gala, Whitmore's CEO attended with his wife, whom we will call Madison Grant. Madison was deeply involved in philanthropic circles, chairing benefit events that drew politicians and media personalities. Charity galas of this scale, often covered by outlets such as Town and Country and regional business journals, serve dual purposes: fundraising and influence cultivation. Seating charts are strategic. Introductions are deliberate. Access signals hierarchy. According to attendees later interviewed by reporters, Madison had spent months organizing the event, positioning it as a celebration of responsible urban growth, language that echoed the messaging of firms bidding for federal infrastructure allocations. When she noticed Daniel Reed near the reserved section, Accounts differ on what she assumed. Some witnesses claim she mistook him for staff. Others suggest she questioned his presence more pointedly. What remains undisputed is that her remark, captured faintly on a guest's smartphone, implied he did not belong in that circle. Moments later, the wine glass tipped. Whether accidental or impulsive, the gesture carried symbolic weight. Daniel Reed's reaction would later be dissected across business blogs and opinion columns. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten legal action in the ballroom. Instead, he excused himself. Behavioral analysts often note that executives accustomed to high-stakes negotiations understand the value of delayed response. In corporate governance literature, restraint is frequently described as leverage when authority rests elsewhere. Reed left the venue and placed a call to his chief compliance officer. By 10:05 p.m., internal review protocols were initiated regarding bidders under evaluation. This procedure mirrored real-world procurement safeguards designed to assess ethical risk, especially when public funds are involved. Overnight, Whitmore's file moved from recommended to under reassessment. By morning, procurement attorneys were examining whether public conduct reflecting bias could expose the allocation committee to political scrutiny. In an era when viral clips can trigger shareholder lawsuits and congressional inquiries, perception alone can alter financial trajectories. When Whitmore's board convened the next day, they were initially unaware of the Gala incident. Their focus was on timelines, lobbying efforts, and projected stock impact. Mid-meeting, a communications advisor forwarded the circulating video. Though brief, it suggested hostility toward a figure who, hours later, they realized chaired the allocation panel. Corporate crisis manuals, many modeled after frameworks developed following crises like the BP oil spill or Wells Fargo account scandal, emphasize rapid containment. Whitmore's public relations team drafted statements about inclusion and respect. Madison resigned from the charity board within 24 hours, citing personal reasons. Yet procurement committees operate on formal criteria. Reed documented the incident within compliance channels, citing reputational risk and potential political fallout. The contract was reopened to competitive review. Within 48 hours, a rival consortium received provisional approval. Markets reacted swiftly. Whitmore's stock declined sharply, echoing patterns observed when major bids collapse unexpectedly. In subsequent weeks, commentators debated whether Reed's decision was purely procedural or personally influenced. Business ethicists frequently argue that leadership extends beyond balance sheets into conduct. Public procurement guidelines published by federal agencies stress impartiality and integrity as core pillars. Whitmore's leadership insisted the incident was social, unrelated to corporate policy. However, shareholders demanded accountability for exposure created by executive households, a governance issue increasingly scrutinized as social media erodes boundaries between private and corporate identity. 6 months later, amid declining investor confidence, Whitmore's CEO stepped down, replaced by an interim restructuring specialist. Analysts described the transition as strategic, though insiders acknowledged the lost contract accelerated the timeline. Meanwhile, Reed's firm finalized the redevelopment project with another bidder, channeling billions into transit upgrades and housing initiatives similar to those outlined in nationwide infrastructure renewal efforts reported extensively by national news outlets. Years from now, business schools may frame this story as a case study in perception risk. One moment in a ballroom, dismissed by some as minor, triggered a chain of governance decisions, legal reviews, market reactions, and leadership changes. The lesson extends beyond etiquette. In modern corporate America, authority is often invisible until exercised. Status displayed in a room does not always equate to control over outcomes. Contracts hinge on trust, and trust can erode in seconds. For the guests who watched wine stain a tuxedo that evening, it appeared to be a social misstep. For the markets that opened the next morning, it was a recalibration of risk. And for the companies involved, it became a defining chapter, proof that in a world governed by compliance frameworks, investor scrutiny, and public accountability, the cost of misjudging influence can reach into the billions. The questions began circulating before the ballroom staff had even finished clearing the tables. Who exactly was the man in the tailored tuxedo? Why did he stand there without anger, without embarrassment, without even a raised voice? Why was a single contract, one among thousands signed every year in corporate America, so critical that its collapse could destabilize a publicly traded company. And perhaps most importantly, did Madison Grant's husband understand, in that moment, what she had set in motion? To understand how a brief exchange at 9:17 p.m. transformed into a financial disaster measured in the billions, we need to understand the players at the center of it. Because the man she embarrassed, Daniel Reed, had already made a decision before she picked up the glass. Daniel Reed was not loud, not theatrical, and not prone to public displays of power. Industry profiles had occasionally referenced him as one of the most disciplined capital allocators in the infrastructure sector, a self-made executive who rose through the ranks without inheriting a board seat or a family name engraved on a headquarters building. Born to a middle-class household in Ohio, Reed financed his education through scholarships and early consulting work, eventually founding Reed Capital Partners during a period when municipalities across the United States were increasingly turning to private equity firms to fund large-scale urban redevelopment projects. Financial publications over the past decade have documented how infrastructure investment became a cornerstone strategy for pension funds and sovereign wealth vehicles seeking stable, long-term returns. Reed positioned himself at the intersection of that movement. He built relationships with city planners, federal committees, and institutional investors, quietly assembling a portfolio that expanded into transportation, housing, and public utilities. By the time of the Gala, Daniel Reed chaired the Allocation Advisory Board overseeing a government-backed infrastructure deal projected at just over $1 billion. His signature alone did not finalize approval, but his recommendation carried decisive weight. Across the room that evening stood Charles Whitmore, Madison Grant's husband and the third-generation chief executive of Whitmore Holdings. The company's history stretched back to the late 20th century, when Charles's grandfather secured highway and defense contracts during a period of rapid national expansion. For decades, Whitmore Holdings symbolized stability, blue-chip credibility, long-term government partnerships, predictable dividends. But market conditions had shifted. Recent quarterly reports reflected tightening margins and increased competition from leaner firms structured around modern financing models. Analysts had noted that the Federal Urban Infrastructure Initiative represented more than growth for Whitmore. It represented reassurance to investors who were beginning to question its adaptability. Internal projections reportedly assumed that securing the contract would lift earnings guidance and support the company's stock price during a fragile fiscal year. In other words, the deal was not optional. It was central to Whitmore Holdings' strategic survival. And then there was Madison Grant. Within philanthropic and political circles, she was known as a meticulous curator of influence. She chaired charitable foundations, hosted fundraising galas attended by governors and media personalities, and maintained an unspoken authority over who belonged in certain spaces and who did not. In high society environments, perception functions as currency. Seating arrangements, introductions, acknowledgments, each detail reinforces hierarchy. Madison had spent months organizing the benefit that night, branding it as a celebration of responsible urban growth, language that aligned seamlessly with the very infrastructure proposal under review by Daniel Reed's advisory board. To her, the evening was a showcase of order and reputation. When she confronted Reed near the reserved section, witnesses later suggested she interpreted his quiet presence as an intrusion into a carefully managed ecosystem. What she did not see was the invisible ledger of authority he carried. The contract itself was more than a line item on a balance sheet. Structured as a public-private partnership, it aimed to fund transit modernization and housing redevelopment across several Midwestern cities, echoing the broader national push toward infrastructure revitalization reported widely in economic policy briefings. Federal guidelines attached to such projects include ethical review standards and reputational assessments, mechanisms designed to ensure that taxpayer-backed funds are awarded to firms demonstrating integrity and compliance. Reed's advisory board had already narrowed the field to two primary contenders, Whitmore Holdings and a consortium led by a newer, aggressively structured competitor. Internal memoranda indicated that Whitmore held a slight advantage based on legacy performance metrics. But reputational risk clauses meant that final recommendations required confidence not only in operational capability, but in corporate judgment. That detail would soon matter more than anyone in the ballroom realized. As speculation intensified in the days following the gala, industry commentators dissected the sequence of events with clinical precision. Why didn't Daniel Reed react emotionally when the wine soaked through his shirt? Behavioral economists often describe delayed response as a strategic advantage in negotiations where leverage is asymmetric. Reed understood that authority need not be displayed to be effective. He knew the contract review window remained open. He knew the advisory memo had not yet been finalized. And he knew that procurement frameworks increasingly prioritize public perception in an era when a 30-second video can shape shareholder sentiment overnight. Charles Whitmore, by contrast, had spent years operating within inherited networks where reputation was assumed rather than scrutinized. The difference in approach, self-made strategist versus legacy executive, created a fault line that became visible only after the incident. By the time Charles Whitmore received confirmation that Reed chaired the allocation panel, the reassessment process was already underway. Compliance officers had documented the gala footage. Legal advisors reviewed clauses addressing reputational exposure. Investors, alerted by early whispers, began recalculating risk scenarios. What appeared, on the surface, to be a fleeting social embarrassment revealed itself as a governance crisis with tangible financial consequences. And the most unsettling realization for Whitmore Holdings was this. The decision to reopen evaluation protocols had been initiated before Madison Grant's wine glass ever struck the floor. Daniel Reed, observing the exchange unfold, had already weighed the implications. The moment she reached forward, the calculus had been made. Daniel Reed's story did not begin in ballrooms or boardrooms. He was a first-generation college graduate, raised in a household where financial stability meant predictability, not leverage. Those who worked with him in his early years describe a young analyst who stayed long after others left, studying municipal budgets and capital flow reports the way some people study playbooks. He entered private equity at a time when infrastructure was shifting from purely public funding models to hybrid partnerships, a transformation widely documented across financial media over the last 2 decades. Seeing opportunity where others saw bureaucracy, Daniel Reed founded his firm with a narrow focus: distressed urban assets that could be stabilized through disciplined capital allocation and long-term operational oversight. There were no inherited board seats, no family connections in Washington, no legacy reputation to lean on. What he built came from negotiation, patience, and calculated restraint. Industry peers began to notice a pattern in his leadership style. He rarely reacted publicly. He avoided headline-grabbing interviews. He declined panels unless the discussion centered on measurable outcomes. His reputation solidified around one defining trait: disciplined, almost clinical composure under pressure. By the time of the gala, Daniel Reed had quietly positioned himself as chair of the advisory board reviewing the $1 billion federal infrastructure allocation that Whitmore Holdings so urgently needed. The project, structured as a government-backed partnership, would modernize transportation systems and expand housing access across several metropolitan regions. The shortlist process had narrowed competitors to 2 primary firms. Whitmore Holdings held historical credibility. The rival consortium held momentum and aggressive innovation metrics. Daniel Reed's recommendation would carry significant influence in tipping the scale. Yet few in social circles connected his reserved demeanor with the authority he exercised in policy meetings. He had a habit at events. He never announced who he was. He observed. He watched how executives treated servers. He listened to how leaders described competitors. He evaluated posture, tone, and judgment long before contracts were signed. For men who built careers on strategic patience and long-game thinking, that approach resonates deeply. Power, in his world, was measured by who could afford to wait. Charles Whitmore's world operated differently. As the 3rd-generation head of Whitmore Holdings, he inherited not only a company, but an expectation of continuity. His grandfather secured foundational government contracts during a period of rapid national expansion. His father diversified operations into defense and heavy construction. By the time Charles assumed control, the firm was publicly traded, deeply embedded in institutional portfolios, and considered a dependable, if traditional, player in the infrastructure sector. But recent quarters told a less reassuring story. Earnings reports revealed tightening margins. Competitive bids were undercut by leaner firms structured around modern financing vehicles. Analysts began questioning whether Whitmore Holdings could adapt to the evolving procurement landscape, where compliance, public optics, and environmental standards carried increasing weight. Securing the billion-dollar allocation was projected to stabilize stock performance and restore investor confidence. For Charles Whitmore, this was not expansion. It was survival. The board had signaled as much in closed sessions, emphasizing the urgency of demonstrating forward momentum. Madison Grant, meanwhile, operated in a sphere where influence manifested through visibility. She was widely regarded as the social architect of high-profile fundraisers that blended philanthropy with power networking. Governors attended her galas. Business leaders sought invitations. Seating arrangements were carefully curated to reflect status hierarchies understood without being spoken aloud. Madison believed deeply in maintaining order within elite circles. Appearances were not superficial to her. They were structural. Subtle class signaling, who stood where, who was introduced first, who was acknowledged publicly, functioned as social architecture reinforcing rank. Those who knew her described an attention to detail that bordered on rigid. The gala that night was months in the making, designed to celebrate responsible urban growth, language intentionally aligned with the very federal initiative under Daniel Reed's review. When she noticed him near the reserved section, she interpreted his presence through the lens she understood best, visible cues of belonging. She didn't recognize him, but she recognized what she thought he was. By the time the orchestra eased into its second set and waitstaff began refilling glasses, Madison Grant noticed Daniel Reed standing near the velvet rope that separated general guests from the private donor section. The space had been curated with precision. Governors, senior partners from major firms, and long-standing benefactors occupied those tables. Madison moved toward him with the kind of polite smile that conceals inspection. She asked if he needed assistance. Witnesses later recalled her tone as controlled but firm. Daniel Reed answered simply that he was waiting for someone. She glanced at his tuxedo, then at the seating chart she had memorized. His name did not register in her social memory. She gestured lightly toward the other side of the ballroom and mentioned that the private section was reserved. A few nearby guests turned their heads. Conversations softened. In rooms like this, status is observed before it is confirmed. Daniel Reed did not step back. He did not assert his credentials. He remained still, hands loosely folded, eyes steady. The quiet stretched longer than etiquette normally allows. Madison Grant's next comment, captured faintly on a guest's phone, suggested that staff entrances were located through the service corridor. Some witnesses insist she believed he was part of the catering team. Others argue she knew he was a guest, but questioned his place among high-level donors. The distinction remains debated, but the effect was immediate. Eyes followed the exchange. Charles Whitmore, across the room, was mid-conversation with a state transportation advisor and did not notice the shift in atmosphere. Daniel Reed's composure unsettled more than anger might have. He did not defend himself. He did not introduce himself. He observed. Several guests would later admit that his restraint altered the dynamic. It redirected attention toward Madison Grant's insistence rather than his presence. Then came the moment replayed in slow motion across financial news segments and social feeds. As Madison adjusted her grip on a nearly full glass of Bordeaux, her wrist tilted forward. Whether the movement was careless or deliberate remains disputed. The wine spilled across Daniel Reed's shirt, a deep red stain spreading against white fabric. Gasps rippled outward. One guest later claimed she laughed. Another said it was a nervous exhale. A third insisted she smirked briefly before calling for napkins. Security footage from a distant angle shows only the motion, not the expression. In interviews conducted afterward, accounts diverged sharply. What did not diverge was Daniel Reed's response. He accepted a napkin, pressed it lightly against his shirt, and looked directly at Madison Grant. There was no raised voice, no visible anger. He said only 4 words. "I understand." The simplicity of that statement lingered longer than any accusation might have. Some guests interpreted it as dismissal. Others sensed something measured behind it. Charles Whitmore, still unaware, continued outlining projected revenue growth tied to the federal allocation. Inside the ballroom, the music resumed and conversations gradually restarted, though the energy had shifted. Daniel Reed excused himself with a nod and walked toward the exit. Several attendees assumed he would leave out of embarrassment. Few considered that departure might signal evaluation rather than retreat. At 9:32 p.m., according to phone records later referenced in internal reports, Daniel Reed placed a call from the rear entrance of the hotel. In the car waiting at the curb, city lights reflecting across the window, Daniel Reed spoke calmly. "Pull the risk file on Redwood Infrastructure," he instructed, referencing Whitmore Holdings' internal bid designation. There was a pause on the other end of the line as his compliance officer processed the request. Background noise from the Gala could still be faintly heard through the open car door. "And pause the recommendation memo," Daniel Reed added. Silence followed, not from hesitation but from understanding. Inside the ballroom, Charles Whitmore laughed at a joke from a transportation advisor, unaware that the projected certainty of his billion-dollar contract had just shifted into uncertainty. Daniel Reed ended the call without urgency. The decision was procedural, documented, and within his authority. Yet its timing traced directly back to the moment Madison Grant's wine glass tilted forward. Fate. By 7:30 the next morning, Whitmore Holdings' executive boardroom was filled. The agenda had not originally included crisis management, yet the tone shifted the moment Charles Whitmore entered and saw the faces around the table. Overnight, an email from Daniel Reed's advisory office had formally notified the company that the Redwood infrastructure proposal was being placed under extended review pending compliance assessment. The language was neutral, procedural, but devastating in implication. The billion-dollar allocation had been widely forecasted as Whitmore's anchor contract for the next fiscal cycle. Without it, earnings projections would require revision. By 9:12 a.m., market analysts noticed the wording change and flagged it to clients. By 10:03 a.m., Whitmore Holdings stock dipped 8%. The chief financial officer began recalculating exposure scenarios, confusion visible in his tone as he asked what had triggered the reassessment. Charles Whitmore, still unaware of the full context, assured the board it was likely routine scrutiny. He had no reason yet to connect the previous night's gala to the compliance language in that email. Then someone forwarded him a video. The clip had begun circulating among attendees before dawn. Shot from a discreet angle near the donor tables, it captured Madison Grant confronting Daniel Reed near the velvet rope. The audio was imperfect but clear enough to interpret. Her remark about the private section was audible. The motion of the wine glass tipping forward was unmistakable. And Daniel Reed's response, "I understand," cut through the background noise with startling clarity. Within hours, the footage reached a regional business blogger who posted it alongside commentary questioning whether implicit bias had influenced the exchange. Larger outlets followed. Headlines began to frame the incident as more than a social misstep. Opinion panels debated optics. Racial bias at major firm? One segment asked, placing Whitmore Holdings' logo beside still frames from the video. Public relations advisors scrambled to contain the narrative. Advertisers monitoring reputational risk requested clarification. Political staffers quietly signaled concern that awarding federal funds amid such controversy could invite hearings or scrutiny. The compliance review initiated by Daniel Reed no longer appeared abstract. It was unfolding in real time under public observation. Back in the Whitmore boardroom, silence replaced speculation as Charles Whitmore watched the footage for the first time. The room absorbed the sequence without commentary. He saw Madison Grant approach Daniel Reed. He heard her reference the restricted area. He saw the wine spill. And he saw the composure in Daniel Reed's expression. The CFO shifted uncomfortably. A board member leaned forward and asked whether the advisory chair had been identified. A legal counsel responded quietly, confirming that Daniel Reed not only chaired the Infrastructure Allocation Committee but had final recommendation authority pending federal ratification. The realization settled heavily. "You're telling me," Charles Whitmore said slowly, eyes fixed on the paused frame of Daniel Reed standing beneath the chandeliers. "She embarrassed the decision-maker?" No one answered immediately because the answer was self-evident. The extended review was no longer procedural background noise. It was a direct response to reputational risk, triggered by an incident replaying across screens nationwide. And in that moment, Whitmore Holdings understood that the cost of a single exchange at 9:17 p.m. might extend far beyond a temporary stock dip. By the fifth day after the gala, speculation gave way to documentation. Internal correspondence confirmed what Whitmore Holdings had begun to fear. As chair of the advisory board overseeing the Redwood infrastructure allocation, Daniel Reed possessed formal veto authority over final recommendations before federal sign-off. The power was not theatrical, it was procedural, embedded within governance structures designed to protect public funds. He was not acting alone, but his evaluation carried decisive weight. Compounding that reality were two fully qualified alternative bidders who had narrowly trailed Whitmore Holdings in earlier scoring rounds. Both firms had strong environmental compliance ratings and clean public reputations. In addition, Daniel Reed maintained long-standing working relationships with several city officials who privately favored a consortium model emphasizing diversified oversight. The leverage existed long before Madison Grant lifted her glass. The incident simply accelerated scrutiny. Yet the true twist was this: Daniel Reed did not cancel Whitmore's bid immediately. There was no impulsive retaliation, no abrupt public condemnation. Instead, he issued a formal notice citing reputational risk concerns requiring extended compliance evaluation. The language was precise. It referenced federal procurement standards mandating that contractors demonstrate sound judgment and ethical stability when stewarding taxpayer-backed capital. By grounding the reassessment in policy rather than emotion, Daniel Reed insulated the decision from accusations of personal grievance. It was clean, strategic, legal. Within advisory meetings, he emphasized consistency. If public optics could jeopardize confidence in project execution, the board had a responsibility to reassess. The discussion shifted from social conduct to fiduciary duty. Whitmore Holdings' legal team recognized the challenge immediately. There was no clause to contest. Reputational integrity was written into the framework. The board could protest privately, but publicly, the review appeared measured and justified. 2 weeks later, a press conference was scheduled at a Federal Transit Authority building. Charles Whitmore attended with controlled composure, though internal polling suggested investor confidence was eroding. Daniel Reed stood at the podium alongside municipal representatives and outlined the evaluation process in neutral terms. He thanked all bidders for their participation. Then he announced that the Redwood infrastructure allocation would be awarded to a competing consortium citing comprehensive alignment with operational readiness and reputational standards. The phrasing was deliberate. Within minutes, financial networks displayed the headline across lower third banners. Whitmore Holdings stock dropped 23% by the closing bell. Analysts downgraded projections. The board convened again, this time questioning leadership strategy and exposure management. Madison Grant stepped down from her charitable board positions, issuing a brief statement about allowing the organization to move forward without distraction. Yet as damaging as the market reaction proved, it was not the most significant consequence. That still wasn't the biggest consequence. In the weeks following the announcement, as Whitmore Holdings attempted to stabilize investor confidence, Charles Whitmore made a decision he had avoided since the night of the gala. He requested a private meeting with Daniel Reed. There were no press releases about it, no assistants leaking details to reporters. The meeting took place in Daniel Reed's office, a space defined more by framed infrastructure blueprints than decorative prestige. Charles Whitmore arrived prepared, carrying a drafted public statement and a formal apology addressed both to Daniel Reed and to the advisory board. He acknowledged the gala incident directly. He accepted responsibility for the perception it created. He offered to issue a recorded apology and to support any diversity initiative the board deemed appropriate. Daniel Reed listened without interruption, hands folded calmly on the table. When Charles finished, the room settled into a long silence. Then Daniel Reed spoke in the same measured tone he had used the night wine soaked through his shirt. This isn't about apology. It's about judgment. He paused deliberately before adding, "Leadership begins at home." The words were not delivered as accusation, but as assessment. Charles Whitmore understood the implication. The infrastructure contract had not collapsed because of a single spilled glass. It collapsed because the moment revealed a gap in discernment that governance frameworks could not ignore. Within 3 months, Whitmore Holdings announced a strategic restructuring plan designed to restore investor trust. Analysts described it as necessary recalibration. Internally, Pressure mounted from major shareholders demanding executive accountability for reputational exposure. By the end of the second quarter, the board voted to transition leadership, appointing an interim CEO with restructuring experience. 6 months after the gala, Charles Whitmore stepped down from his role, citing a desire to support the company's forward momentum. Madison Grant withdrew from public philanthropic leadership, her invitations to high-profile events noticeably reduced. In elite circles where influence depends on perception, silence can be louder than criticism. The social architecture she once managed shifted without announcement. Meanwhile, Daniel Reed moved forward without public commentary about the incident. His firm finalized the infrastructure project with the selected consortium and later announced a scholarship initiative funded through projected returns, targeting students from underserved communities pursuing degrees in urban planning and engineering. There were no interviews framing it as retaliation or triumph. It was a strategic expansion aligned with long-term investment philosophy, executed without spectacle. In business, deals collapse for many reasons. Market shifts, regulation, competition. Entire strategies can unravel because of interest rate adjustments or supply chain disruptions. But sometimes they collapse because someone underestimates the wrong person. The night Madison Grant confronted Daniel Reed beneath crystal chandeliers, she assessed him through visible cues and assumed authority rested elsewhere. What followed demonstrated how modern governance, public scrutiny, and reputational standards intersect in ways legacy systems once ignored. Charles Whitmore lost more than a contract. He lost the confidence that accompanies consistent judgment. Daniel Reed gained nothing he did not already possess. He simply exercised it. Power rarely announces itself. Now the question shifts from what happened to what it means. Daniel Reed never raised his voice that night. He never publicly condemned Madison Grant. He never accused Charles Whitmore of misconduct. He followed protocol, cited reputational risk, and exercised authority embedded within the governance structure. The contract moved elsewhere. Whitmore Holdings absorbed the loss. Leadership changed. Influence shifted. From a strictly procedural standpoint, every step aligned with federal procurement standards and fiduciary responsibility. But intention is harder to measure than documentation. So consider this carefully. Do you think the contract cancellation was justified? Or was it personal revenge disguised as strategy? When Daniel Reed paused the recommendation memo from the backseat of that car, was he protecting taxpayer interests or responding to a moment that revealed something he could not ignore? And if you were in his position, chairing a billion-dollar allocation, aware that public optics shape public trust, would you have handled it differently? Would you have separated the ballroom from the boardroom? Or do they inevitably overlap in modern leadership? For men who have spent decades navigating corporate structures, negotiating contracts, and managing reputational exposure, this story cuts deeper than a viral clip. It speaks to judgment under observation. It speaks to the unseen weight carried by decision-makers who understand that authority does not require volume. Charles Whitmore built on legacy. Daniel Reed built on discipline. Madison Grant curated status. In the end, structure outweighed spectacle. But perhaps the most important takeaway is this. In today's environment, perception is no longer a side variable. It is part of the balance sheet. And if you think this was calculated, if you believe Daniel Reed moved 3 steps ahead while others reacted in real time, wait until you hear about the CEO who deliberately tanked his own stock to expose his board. Subscribe for more real stories about power, leadership, and the decisions that change everything.